Hi, everyone, and welcome to Practice Growth HQ. Now, today we're going to speak about sustained high performance. And one of the major ways that you need to do that is to avoid burnout. If you continue to perform at a high level and you can do that in a sustainable way, then the growth that you're seeking is almost inevitable. But unfortunately, sometimes we sabotage ourselves by burning out. And so the perfect person to be talking about that is my guest today, Dr. Jo Braid. Now, she is an experienced rehabilitation physician with 20 years in neurorehabilitation and a coach helping healthcare professionals recover from burnout. In some ways, Jo is the coach you never want to have. And so she's learned a lot from working with people, and she's helping us here today, all the way from Orange in New South Wales. Welcome, Jo.
Angus, thanks so much for inviting me to be on the podcast. Great to connect with you and your audience.
Absolutely. The truth is, Jo and I met at an awards event in Sydney a few weeks ago. Neither of us, maybe quite a few weeks ago now, neither of us live in Sydney. I was a bit surprised to find out she lives where she does. But as soon as I heard what she did, I was like, we need to get you on the podcast. Now, Jo, we like to start with the fast five, quicker questions and quicker answers so people can get to know you. Question one, where did you grow up?
I grew up in Cambridge in the UK.
Oh, there we are. Yes, I thought I detected a bit of an accent. Question two, favorite book besides your own?
Great question. One that I highly recommend and send to clients all the time is Atomic Habits by
In,
James Clear.
indeed. Believe it or not, at this moment, I run a business group for fledgling business people. I just do it on a voluntary basis. And we as a group are working through that book together at the moment. All
Awesome.
right. Question three, what's one of your superpowers?
Yeah, one of my superpowers is breaking the complex down to easy to understand, simple information.
Yes, particularly you're dealing with people who have had traumatic brain injuries. One would imagine they've got some cognitive issues there. Question four, something you wish your 20-year-old self knew.
Yeah, I wish she didn't have the self-doubt that she had and she could see the potential that she has created in her life.
Interesting, interesting. And then finally, Jo, question five, something you're grateful for.
You know what, Angus? I'm super grateful for choosing to move to Australia for the remainder of my medical career. I did 1 year in the UK in the NHS, got out after 100-hour weeks, and I've had an amazing career, family, life in Australia over the past 21 years.
Okay, that's great. And may I say thank you for moving here. That sounds flippant, but all the better for Australia that you're here. You did an undergraduate doctor degree, then you then became a specialist physician, and
Mhm.
then you happened into the space of rehabilitation, neurorehabilitation. Now, we're here to help the listeners with their business, but one thing they've absolutely got to avoid is burnout. And I believe you've got your own personal experience with that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I didn't get burnout really doing 100-hour weeks as a junior doctor in the UK, which is quite amazing. I soon went down to 40-hour weeks here in Australia, so huge difference there. It was it was more when I was a fully established consultant, but I was working quite part-time. I decided to open my own clinic here in Orange. So definitely solopreneurship, setting it up, having my own rooms, having my list of patients. And I was also upskilling in the area of lifestyle medicine, which you might be familiar with as well. So it's quite an expansive basis of medicine, different to what we learn in medical school currently. And I just didn't know when I knew enough. I kept on studying. There's lots of different schools, but there's no specialty training for this. I had really young kids at that point. I had 3 sons under 5.
Wow.
So I opened my clinic when my youngest was a year old, which really looking back, I was like, why on earth? But anyhow, that's what I thought was a great idea at the time. And about 4 years later, we were then in the pandemic. My mum in the UK was unwell, and I had to beg, plea to DFAT, Department of Foreign Affairs, to
Mm,
get out of the country. And my first application was actually thrown back. And I was like slightly offended and just thought, gosh, how can you get out of this country that you've taken as a guarantee you can grow up somewhere else and travel all around? Anyway, I went back and rehabbed mum for 4 weeks in Cambridge and just took stock and evaluated where I was at. was actually having some coaching then. Fortunately, coaching is a thing that has managed to thrive despite the pandemic.
Mm.
And I really evaluated what I wanted to do with this clinic, which was in a way somewhat optional. It was up to me. I was the only one driving it. And I called it that I was going to close it with 6 months notice. And yeah, that was my foray or my landing into burnout that was really gradual, didn't really realize what was going on, definitely cynical about the work I was doing, definitely decreased productivity in what I was managing to do, and exhausted, which could be an overlay of 3 young kids and sleepless nights and that, but it could also have been the burnout. And now I can see all of those signs that back then I wasn't really so aware of. So that was my lowest point, and that was when coaching actually really helped me get out and make decisions about my life that were really up to me.
Okay, that's interesting. I feel like a talk show host with people dialing in to tell us about their medical problems, but let's assume that we've got a listener right now who's going, I must admit, I feel like I'm heading down this path a little bit. There's a part of me from either my personal kind of drivers or maybe my family upbringing, go, 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 go. There's a little bit of that in my family. And if I'm not throwing myself into what I'm doing, then obviously there's something wrong with me. And yet we've just heard a cautionary tale about burnout, and indeed we would be aware of people who've done this. What are the signs that people maybe they're heading down this path and may need to stop?
Yeah, you can have that. You can break it down into physical, emotional, and mental symptoms or signs that people might have, which is quite a span. And that's how I'd usually run a workshop around this. Physically, and so physical symptoms, if we put it out this way, it almost looks like it's a medical condition, but this is not actually a medical condition we're talking about here. I don't diagnose it as a doctor.
Hmm.
I say it's like a risk of burnout as a coach with people. But yeah, you might be getting headaches, you might be getting stomach aches. You obviously will be having fatigue. That is definitely a part of the burnout. You may notice yourself withdrawing from social connection with other people. You're not such an active team player as you used to be. You might find that you have a bit of brain fog and your memory bank is just not working as well as it used to. Making decisions is really hard. You feel a bit stuck in the mud as to where to go to next.
Since you're a doctor, Joe, can you explain to us what's happening physiologically, biologically, when
Yeah,
that's
sure. It's generally chronic stress. And the original diagnosis or the original condition of burnout was described as chronic occupational stress that's unrelenting and unrelieved and happened for a long period of time. So we've got high cortisol running through the body. It's not just spikes of adrenaline, it's constant high cortisol. That's really not good for our body, whether it's from the workplace or it's from some other scenario that we're running a high cortisol. Um,
is that's a neurotransmitter, is that correct? The cortisol? Is it it's
um,
a
it's
hormone, a chemical? What is it?
Yeah, it's a hormone. It's an adrenal hormone, and it's quite inflammatory in itself. So it can be affecting our sleep. That's another common symptom that people will either have early morning waking or very hard to get to sleep. It impacts how our brain is working as well. We might not be using our prefrontal lobe, decision making, executive function skills as well as we were before. And you want to break from it, and people will potentially get into some of those addictions, whether it's social media, whether it is alcohol,
Hmm.
that they might start using of an evening to try and escape that feeling of constantly on and chronic stress.
And I've heard a little about cortisol. Is it the fight or flight drug? Is that true?
Yeah, so we've got adrenaline, which is short term, and so that will raise your heart rate and raise your blood pressure and be ready for action. Cortisol is more like the long term, something's not right here. It's not just having the saber-toothed tiger outside the cave. If we go for that very old analogy,
Yep.
it's like this constant level of stress and almost anxiety that people will notice the whole time, and just hard to switch off and hard to get a break from it.
Okay, that's interesting. I would admit to you, I identify with a couple of those symptoms. I must admit, I do wake up a bit early, usually not thinking about business.
Mhm.
But the other parts, that's interesting. And look, I'm sure many of the listeners can identify with some of these. So, what is causing this? Is it just trying to jam too much into every minute of every day?
Yeah. So we've got a combination of reasons of triggers for burnout. So we can certainly have the workplace triggers. And I'm not sure how much autonomy your listeners do have on their workplace. Sometimes people working in healthcare institutions and that they actually don't have that much autonomy. But things like overwork is definitely a risk factor. A sense that there's a lack of fairness, that's another one. Misaligned values, either with people in your team or with your workplace, and a lack of recognition. Those are 4 common risk factors for vulnerability to burnout. And then we look at the individual as well. And what are their sort of natural traits that they've got that may have come from upbringing, as you've suggested? Do they have a perfectionist trait? So that's super high standards, high expectations for themselves. It's not usually externally driven, it's very internal. Procrastination as well. So that can tie in with the perfectionism that you're avoiding failure by not getting started. You can't fail if you don't start a task.
Mm.
And then thirdly, people pleasing is another one that I see. I want to be perceived as nice. I don't want the patients to think that I'm not nice. So I give them extra time in clinic. I give a more detailed explanation, and I'll do the medical certificate and the script and the ultrasound form, whatever your people need, an X-ray form. They'll go the distance to do lots of things that are almost beyond their scope or beyond what the clinician needs to do. They can delegate things to other people, so their boundaries are really soft, if non-existent. So that's just 3 personality traits I'd look at in somebody as well.
Okay. The listeners have identified, they said, I feel like this could be me. What do we do? What do we do? This is not all or nothing. I assume there's a
It's
kind of
not.
a continuum, and
Yes.
dare I say, there are perhaps days or even phases where we're more down that path than less. What should we be doing?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that point around self-awareness is a great place to start, because so often we don't seem to even check in with ourselves and say, how am I really going?
Mm,
Feeling like the victim of the situation that we're in. What are the choices that we actually have here?
mm.
The 4 parts that I recommend for people, I talk about on my podcast as well, are sleep, movement, mindset, and support. So I often say it's really hard to solve anything if you're sleep deprived, and a lot of people are. The stats on sleep deprivation are not great. So somehow they think that 6 hours a night is the normal amount of sleep. I personally disagree with that. You should be getting around, I reckon, 7 hours of sleep minimum most nights of the week. Looking at
Yeah.
that regular bedtime as much as you look for a regular wake up time.
I've spent a fair bit of time in this space, and I've heard figures suggesting more like 8 listeners, probably 8 to 9. Some of the most elite athletes on the planet. There's an NBA player whose name escapes me, but will come to me, who at some point has been sleeping like 12 hours a night. Now, for some of us, you're like, get serious, Angus. I've got 3 kids under 5. Like, that's not happening. But it was extraordinary, Joe. I was with my team last week. I work remotely, and I asked them how many hours of sleep they were getting a night, and we went around the table, and I couldn't believe it. It was like 5, 6, some people were even less, and I just maybe you can do that in your 20s for a while, but I was going to say as you get older, that's
Mm.
much more difficult to do, and I noticed the impact of that quite significantly.
Mm.
So look, shoot for 8 hours.
Absolutely.
And if you miss, you might get 7.5.
That's a great way to go. And I think that sporting analogy, that's something I've actually quite often used with my clients, because often they are also like athletes, endurance athletes, and so forth. And they know what it takes to be at their peak performance as an athlete. So when we bring that analogy into recovering from burnout so that you can be at your peak performance for your clinical role, they see the value of the rest and recovery. It works for sport, but is sometimes not normalized for the clinician or the average worker.
Yeah, we don't need to be as physically fit to do our job. LeBron James was the one I was
Oh,
thinking
yeah,
of.
sure.
On the other hand, I'd argue in some mental fitness is pretty important too. Now,
Mhm.
you mentioned 4 things. Sleep, we've spoken about. Movement.
Yes.
Dr. Joe, come on, what what should we be doing there?
So movement is a great way to discharge our cortisol. So this stress hormone that's produced on the daily so often, if we move our bodies, we know that's a great way to release it. And then our brains and our bodies are feeling safer again. It's like the alarms and the alert for the stress is dissipated. So take your pick, do what works for you. If it's slow movement like a yoga or Pilates kind of thing, go for that. If it's outdoors, if it's with somebody else, if it's dance, if it's bikes, whatever, do movement. That's why I don't say exercise. I think movement just allows us to
Mm.
not feel like it's any punishing kind of hard yakka.
And how much?
Really, I think the evidence for dissipating that cortisol, it can be 5 to 10 minutes per day.
Wow.
So that's not much.
No, it's not. I gather there's a whole stack of evidence for other benefits of exercise, which probably require a bit longer, even
Yeah.
things like bone density,
Yes. Yeah.
which gets important when you're on the wrong side of 50 like me.
Yeah. Yeah. Sure.
All right, number
Yeah, I'd
3.
say 20 to 30 minutes would be good. Yeah, if you can do that.
Okay, number 3. You're much more gentle than I am. So I'm like, if you can, no, we've got to make this a priority. We're not here to get on your case, listeners. We want you to be successful.
Mm.
Number 3, mindset.
Yeah. How's your outlook? That self-awareness I talked about already. How's your boundary setting? Are you confident around when you're going to say no to something, or is it always a yes? And then you realize afterwards, oh my, that should have been a no. I think mindset management ties in with time management, such an important part for any business owner. I often have clinicians that find themselves overcommitting, running out of time, doing more when they get home in the evening. That's affecting the relationships at home. So, set out what you're going to achieve early on in the day and see how that rolls out for your time management through the day. What else? Thinking about your expectations you set for yourself in terms of that perfectionism trait as well.
Mm.
What is the standard that's realistic, not infinite horizon kind of style expectation for yourself there? And I would say definitely with the mindset approach, bringing in some self-compassion. So you
Yeah.
might think that I'm a little bit more gentle, but I think really instead of being the harsh inner critic, bring on that we also say inner coach. If you imagined you were coaching your kid or you were coaching a team around something, what would that language sound like to you in
Mm.
your mind there? It's a
Mm.
much more enjoyable journey and it's
Mm.
much more likely to be sustained.
I love that. I think I'm adopting that one, Joe. If I learn nothing else from this podcast, look, there are a few things that occur to me about mindset. I learned one of these from a member of my team. One of my routines is before I get out of bed, I try to say 10 things that I'm grateful for. And I've started making sure that at least one of those is about me, because it's
Mm,
quite easy to say I'm grateful that I got a roof over my head and food on the table, etc. But to go,
mm,
okay, well done, Angus. What did you actually do? I think that's a really important one. And then I guess I've found myself going, no, Angus, you don't need to be quite as hard on yourself. The truth is, for me personally, I've got quite if you do the Strengths Finder, I've got
mm-hmm.
quite an achiever thing. That's
Yeah,
one of the things that makes me tick. I love doing things because they're there when I've never done it before. But
sure.
I'm learning. I'm getting better at someone on the podcast told me what to say. I'm much better now at sort of
Mm,
going, hey, you know what? You made some progress. It wasn't perfect, but you made some progress. You are
yeah,
today where you weren't yesterday. So off you go.
yes.
And then Joe, number 4, support.
Mm. I'll just give your listeners a little phrase to think about on the mindset: imperfect consistency.
I like it.
Maybe that's what you're doing. I certainly do that all the time. It's just an approach. You might miss one day of doing something, you get back in the saddle the next day. Try not to miss it twice, kind of thing.
Mm, mm.
And that imperfect consistency approach. So then support. Who's your team around you? And there's lots of different ways that people will talk about this, like who are your circles around you? I know Richard Branson talks about that, your inner circle being yourself. And do not discount that support you can have for yourself and that sort of inner trust and inner safety that you've got your own back no matter what.
It's really interesting. I look, that support's really important. This is a show about growing business, growing
Mm,
practices, and if I've learned anything in my time in business, sorry, you don't get to do that by yourself. Can you think of a single example of
mm,
someone where you go, wow, they've achieved amazing things in the business sphere all by themselves? And the answer is no.
no.
You need support. In fact, I would say, honestly, one of the most liberating things that happened for me when I hit 40 was I
Hmm.
went, you know what? I don't have to be good at everything. I realize it's okay. Get support. There are some things I know I'm not good at. And I don't know, I felt like in my younger years, it was this, oh, you're not very good over there, so you better work hard there.
Mm,
But all of the research around strengths finders and the most elite performers on the planet is they're really only good at a handful of things,
yes.
and then they've got the support around them to help them.
Yeah.
So I think
Yeah.
that's great. Wow, Joe, I'm really hoping listeners you're getting a lot out of this because that's a very simple model to use. I'll go through it again. 1, sleep; 2, movement; 3, mindset; and 4, support. And sometimes just a tiny little thing that Joe said that you can create a shift in you can really have a big difference. I really love the imagine yourself being a coach of, I'm going to say, 6-year-olds. You know,
Right. Yeah.
so there's no question about elite, well, for 99% of the population, there's no question about elite performance for 6-year-olds. They're there to
Yeah.
have fun, but you want to improve them. And I think that mindset's really cool.
Yeah. Fantastic.
Now, Joe, as we start to finish up then, final thoughts for some of the listeners. We want practice growth, we want sustained high performance, but we must avoid burnout.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. As you said, take one of those approaches that I've talked about there. You don't have to do them in order. I would say that if sleep's a problem, that will pay off well to start off with that one.
Mm.
But all of those can be taken on as a burnout preventative approach, which I'm really encouraging people to be aware of as well. I thought for your listeners, I've grown 2 businesses. This second business is much more sustainable than my first one ever was. And what is some of the difference around it? So my team of support is getting coaching and investing in coaching. And so I have a business coach who I've worked with for well over a year. I've had different coaches who I've worked with, but this coach, we're getting through great achievements together and goals together, and there's a lot of support there as well. And I wonder if that might be one of your edges if you are a clinician looking to expand your business, to find somebody that works for you or works with you, that the connection is there, and reach out and get that support through coaching as well. There's so much evidence around it. It's often at the exec level of corporates, hasn't quite flowed into healthcare as much, but there are quite a few healthcare coaches out there now.
Yeah, I'm definitely drinking from the Kool-Aid there.
Yep.
I have worked with a coach. In fact, honestly, I've typically had multiple coaches at any
Mm,
given time. I've had a business coach. We've got a couple at the moment, and I've had one business coach for about 10 years. But I've just found, I don't know, again, maybe this is my sort of achiever mindset coming out. I'm like, what is this thing you want to do? Why should you learn it from scratch like, why reinvent the wheel? So I've literally had a video shooting coach. I've had a running coach.
yeah.
I've had a weight trainer coach. These are all physical things. And
Mm,
then coaches in various parts of business as well. And my mindset has always been, hey, put your foot on the accelerator where you can. And if that
yeah.
means that you've got to engage someone to help you with that, one, there's a learning aspect. And I think if we looked at our 4 points again, then that
Mm,
support aspect, this same coach that I've been with for 10 years, honestly, we meet for 90 minutes once a month. And there are
mhm.
sometimes we would spend 60 minutes, basically me just talking about what's going on.
Sure.
And the
Mm,
support element, I'd pay you double for the last hour. Like, it's
yeah.
so valuable.
Yeah. I see coaching as 2 brains on one person's issues. It's
Mm,
really laser focused. It's really listening in, and it's without the judgment of the coach. They might bring advice if asked, but generally coaches are not there for their opinion and their advice, depending on what sort of space they're in. But yeah, those 2 brains on one problem can be a really great approach to take.
absolutely. Now, Joe, if people want to get in touch with you or learn more, what should they do?
Thanks, Angus. I'm on various different social media platforms. I'm on LinkedIn as Dr. Joe Braid. I'm on Instagram and Facebook as Burnout Recovery Doctor. My website is Dr. Joe Braid. And if you want me in your ears, my podcast is the Burnout Recovery Podcast.
Marvelous. So that's Dr. Joe Braid. So J-O and then B-R-A-I-D. And yes, find her in one of the many things that she's just mentioned, the Burnout Recovery Podcast. Listeners, I say to you without a hint of insincerity, I hope you never burn out. I hope that you can listen to this and you can just recognize the signs and just take some steps as a result of today to avoid that in the future. Joe, I'm so glad that I met you at that awards dinner, however many weeks ago it was. I'm so glad I invited you onto the podcast, and I'm so glad that you agreed.
Yep, you're so welcome, Angus. I think it's two months to today, actually, that we were down there in the Shangri-La celebrating that night away. Thank you so much. It's been great to be on your podcast today.
Absolutely. All right, everyone, we've covered a lot there, haven't we? I know I say this every week, but my goodness, I think if you were to look through the transcript, we've probably given you 10 or 15 things that you could do in this space. And believe me, without a hint of insincerity, Joe and I desperately want you to avoid burnout. The fact is, the society, community needs you being at the top of your game in healthcare. We appreciate you, and so we don't want to see you going down the wrong path. Now, look, as I say every week, we've learned a lot, but that not knowledge is power, it's applied knowledge that's power. And the question is, what is one thing you can do as a result of what you heard today? Make sure you go and do that before you go on to the next thing. Finally, if you got some value from our time today, then please go to where you heard this podcast, leave us a lovely review to give us the encouragement to bring you more great content every week on Practice Growth HQ.